There's a certain tragedy in being the one who gave their best to someone who didn't recognize its value. You loved honestly, stood by them through storms, and offered a level of emotional depth most people spend their lives searching for. But when someone is too caught up in themselves, too distracted by ego, pride, or emotional immaturity, they don't notice the treasure right in front of them. They confuse your loyalty with predictability. They mistake your softness for fragility. And slowly, without even realizing it, they begin to take your kindness for granted. In the beginning, they probably appreciated it. Most people do when something is new. They marveled at your patience, your attentiveness, the way you made them feel seen in ways no one else had. But familiarity breeds entitlement in those who lack emotional intelligence. Instead of cherishing your consistency, they began to expect it. Instead of being grateful for your emotional labor, they began to demand it. Over time, what once felt like a gift to them became background noise, always there, always accessible, no longer special. And still, you stayed, because that's what good souls do. You gave the benefit of the doubt. You offered second chances, sometimes even thirds and fourths. You rationalized the neglect, the coldness, the passive aggression, telling yourself they were just going through something, that they'd come around. You convinced yourself that if you just loved a little harder, were a little more patient, gave a little more, maybe they'd finally realize your worth. But they didn't. They only saw how far you'd bend and pushed to see how far you'd break. You weren't asking for much. You weren't asking to be worshipped or idolized. You just wanted to be seen, to be respected, to be treated with the same care and consideration you offered so freely. But every time you asked for those things, they made you feel like you were asking for too much. So you stopped asking. You internalized the neglect. You started to wonder if maybe you were the problem. It's what happens when someone chips away at your self-worth over time. You start believing their indifference is a reflection of your value. But then something inside you started to change. It wasn't overnight. It was gradual, subtle at first. A moment of hesitation before texting back, a tightening in your chest when they dismissed your feelings, a growing sense of distance, not because you wanted to withdraw, but because staying began to feel like self-abandonment. And eventually, you reached that point, that quiet, powerful moment when you realized you deserve more. And when you finally left, whether physically or emotionally, it wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't to prove a point or make them suffer. It was simply a choice to stop suffering yourself. You reclaimed the energy that was being drained, the love that was being misused, the effort that was being wasted. You didn't need to yell or explain. You just removed yourself from the equation. And that silence was louder than any words could have been. That's when it hit them. Not when you were pleading, not when you were crying or trying to salvage what was left, but when you stopped, when the texts stopped coming, when you no longer asked how they were doing, when you stopped waiting for them to show up differently. That's when they felt the absence they never thought they'd have to feel. That's when they realized that the person they thought would always be there was gone. They're left with echoes, memories of your warmth, the little things you did without being asked, the way you forgave what others wouldn't. They start replaying it all, the late-night conversations, the unconditional support, the way you were their safe place, even when they made you feel unsafe. And the regret starts to creep in, not because they lost someone who begged to be loved, but because they lost someone who already loved them fully, and they couldn't see it until it was too late. Now they're stuck with the reality they created, a reality where they let go of a good soul because they were too self-absorbed to appreciate what they had, a reality where they convinced themselves you were replaceable, only to realize that not everyone loves the way you do, that not everyone shows up the way you did, that not everyone has the emotional capacity to hold space for another person like you could. They remember how easy you made things for them, how you listened without judgment, how you supported their dreams, how you offered grace in moments when they didn't deserve it, and they feel the void. Because that kind of love doesn't come around every day. It's not something you find on a whim. It's built over time through trust, vulnerability, and consistent care. And once it's gone, it leaves behind a silence that's impossible to ignore. But by then, you've already started to rebuild. You've redirected your energy inward. You've started healing the wounds you once overlooked. You've begun to understand that their inability to love you properly was never about your worth. It was about their limitation. And with that realization comes peace, because you know now that letting go wasn't a loss. It was a return to yourself. There comes a point in every good-hearted person's journey when they stop explaining, stop begging to be understood, and stop chasing closure from those who never intended to offer it. Silence at that point becomes the most powerful response. For the person who let go of you, your silence is more than just the absence of words. It's a confrontation they can't escape. It's the message they weren't ready to hear, delivered without drama, noise, or even anger. It's the mirror they've been avoiding, now staring them down with clarity. They didn't realize that the very silence they thought meant indifference was actually the sound of them learning a painful truth. They lost someone who was irreplaceable. Before that silence, there were likely many attempts on your part to make things work. You tried to communicate, to explain how their actions affected you. You gave them the benefit of the doubt, assumed they didn't realize what they were doing, and told yourself they'd do better if they truly understood how much they were hurting you. But what they didn't understand, or didn't care to understand, is that every time they dismissed your feelings, every time they turned the blame on you, and every time they ignored the weight of your words, they were teaching you to stop talking altogether. That's what silence is born from. It's not coldness. It's not a lack of emotion. It's the final expression of 1,000 unspoken hurts. When someone ignores your voice for long enough, you eventually decide to protect your peace instead of defending your pain. And when that moment comes, when your silence finally replaces the pleading, it carries a weight they can't pretend away. At first, they might not notice. They may even feel relieved. They're used to conflict as a tension, used to the sound of you fighting for the relationship, for respect, for decency. So your quiet seems like peace to them at first. They assume it means you've moved on, or worse, that you've finally accepted their behavior. But as days turn into weeks and they realize that silence isn't temporary, it's permanent, panic begins to set in. That's when they start replaying everything you ever said, all the warnings, all the moments you tried to speak from the heart, all the signs they chose to ignore. Your silence forces them to sit with the consequences they never imagined they'd have to face. They start to remember the way your voice used to sound when you were trying to hold things together, the way you used to reach out, even when you had every reason not to, the way you offered patience, forgiveness, and space. And they begin to realize they mistook your strength for surrender. They thought you were too invested to ever leave the conversation. Because the truth is, people who take others for granted never believe the day will come when the other person simply stops responding. They rely on the chaos. They rely on your reactions. They thrive on the emotional feedback loop, whether it's love, frustration, or sadness, because it keeps them centered in your world. But silence removes them from that center. It leaves them alone with their own thoughts, their own guilt, and their own reflection. And most of all, it leaves them without the comfort of knowing that you still care enough to argue. But you're not angry anymore. That's the beauty of silence. It's not a weapon, it's a release. It's what happens when you no longer want to fight for someone who showed you they were never truly in your corner. It's what happens when you choose peace over pain, dignity over drama. It's a sign that you've healed enough to let go, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for yourself. You don't need them to understand anymore. You don't need them to acknowledge the hurt or to validate your experience. You don't need them to finally say the words they never had the courage to offer, because silence has done what words couldn't. It ended the cycle. It closed the chapter. It became the boundary that saved you from pouring any more of yourself into someone who didn't know how to hold what you gave.